So we have section 9 here, which is constructing news. The next number of lectures we have actually will be news and journalism related and themed. So we'll start with how do you decide what to put on the news? So with so many events and stories to cover, news editors and organizations, they have to decide what to cover, right? Especially if you're in a large city like in Atlanta or New York City or LA. There's so much happening on a daily basis that you have to come up with some way of determining what makes the news and what doesn't. And this process of determining what makes the news and what doesn't, that's called gatekeeping, right? The selection process of gatekeepers results in agenda setting. So by gatekeeping, by having gatekeepers, you are creating an agenda, right? And agenda setting happens because of the topics that you choose. Usually, though, you have to have some kind of identity or brand or some system of news values that you have, the things that you value as news and don't value. You have to have some kind of criteria. And that criteria, that organization's news values, in other words, helps the organization to choose which stories it runs. So we have a number of news values here that I'll talk about. And these are news values that a station or a newspaper or an internet site or whoever's providing the news, this is a list of things that they may consider when selecting news. The first is frequency. Now we've moved into a time where frequency kind of matters less and less in some arenas. In some arenas, it's very still much a thing. By frequency, what I mean is how often do you publish? If you're a newspaper, how often do you print your paper? If you're a newscast on television, how many newscasts do you have during the day? For example, you may have a 5 o'clock show, a 6 o'clock show, and a 10 o'clock show, right? If you're cable news, you're always going. You're always churning out news. If you're a digital site, an internet site, or social media driven or something like that, then it's always going, right? So frequency matters because if something happened, let's say I'm a nightly newscast, right? And so I'm getting ready to do my 10 o'clock at night show. Well, if something actually happened 2 days ago, it's no longer considered fresh or relevant. So that 10 o'clock newscast is probably not going to run that story because they should have ran it 2 days ago and they decided it wasn't important enough at that point to run it. And as a news organization, you don't want to be putting up content that's old, that's not time sensitive, that's not time relevant. Now, that may be the case for a TV newscast. It may also be the case for a daily newspaper. Daily newspaper doesn't want to put news out when that news event happened 2 days ago. But let's say you're a weekly paper, right? A lot of small towns, the one that I was raised in, it had a newspaper come out every Wednesday. So if something happened 2 days ago from then, let's say that it's a Wednesday publication, but the news event happened on a Monday, still very much within the scope of the frequency of publication. So people are going to want to know what happened Monday. They want to go back and find out what happened from last Thursday, the day after publication, or last Wednesday, the day of publication. So your frequency matters. Long, drawn-out events are not favored as much as shorter, discrete events, especially if you're publishing daily or broadcasting a couple of times a day or you're on the internet. But like I said, that can change. If your frequency is more drawn out, then older events do matter. Amplitude is also a news value. And by amplitude, it just means if you think about the old, when you studied waves, like acoustic waves or any kind of physics kind of related wave. Amplitude, right, was how tall the wave is, right? Not how often it happens, but how tall. So amplitude matters because that's the threshold of noticeability. What do I mean about that? Well, is an event that happened, is that large enough to receive prominent coverage? So again, it's determined by where you are. In Starkville, if an apartment complex caught fire and burned down, certainly Starkville News would cover that event. But apartment complexes burn all the time in Atlanta, all the time in LA and New York City. And so it may not make the newspaper or the nightly newscast. Right? If you go to CNN right now, you're not, as far as CNN.com, you're not going to see news about apartment fires. Because for that news organization, the amplitude has to be at a certain level, and if it doesn't reach that level, the noticeability doesn't reach that level, then it's not going to get coverage. So your event has to be dramatic enough or large enough to receive prominent coverage. Again, if you're a small town, the threshold of that amplitude is lower than if you were in a large area. Clarity. We are creatures of language, of narrative. We like stories. We like to hear stories. We like to tell stories. And when you've got a limited number of pages in a newspaper to do that, or a limited amount of time in a newscast to do that, we tend to want things to be clear-cut and one-dimensional, lacking ambiguity. If you're going to tell me a story in the news, tell me who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, what happened to the bad guys, what happened to the good guys, why did this happen? You know, clarity is your basic what, when, why, where, how, right? It's your basic journalistic questions. If a story is ambiguous and you leave it kind of feeling like you don't know who the real villain or who the real hero is, if it's not clear that the story is finished or still ongoing, these things sometimes will make a news editor hesitant to publish. You know, we don't have the full story is what they'll say. So we're not going to release anything until we have the full story. So you're looking for clarity there. Cultural proximity also matters. What does that mean? Well, it means news favors stories that involve practices, places, or people relevant and familiar to the audience. Right? So in the news, we want to hear things that are relevant to our culture. We don't necessarily want to know news that may be relevant to other cultures but not our own. So that stories about far-off lands, they're typically not favored in local news operations. We're not going to hear about what happened in Jackson every day when we turn on WCBI, the Golden Triangle affiliate. Right? And there are things, I mean, it's just not about geography, it's also about, like I said, culture. Right? So, let's say deer hunting season is going to begin. Mississippi has a lot of hunters. Maybe there's something interesting in that the start date for hunting deer is going to be pushed back a week from when it normally starts. For Southerners, that's a big story, right? Oh, okay, well, we need to know that because we were planning on going hunting and we don't want to go at the wrong time and get in trouble. That story is culturally relevant to us. If we were to look at news in LA, the delay of a hunting season probably is not going to get attention. It just doesn't match with that culture, right? It's not important enough culturally. Much in the same way that I'm trying to think of something that happens in the big city. but not in a small town like ours that might make news. A benefit, a gala, I'm trying to think, maybe problems with the subway or something like that. Things that aren't really necessarily relevant to our culture. Well, I'll give you an example. If you live on the coast, then the weather report in terms of the ocean is important. You want to know how many knots the wind is traveling, what are the seas going to be like, rough seas, not rough seas. That's important. If you're landlocked and 5 hours inward landlocked, or if you're in Oklahoma, you don't really care what the weather report for the Atlantic Ocean is, right? So you're not really probably paying too much attention to the hurricane reports. The closer you get to the ocean, the more you will be. So that's just an understanding of cultural proximity. Predictability kind of goes hand in hand with clarity. Clarity, you want clear-cut stories, heroes, villains, wrap up the story, figure out what happened to people. Predictability is also another news value. If something occurs that we expect to occur, it meets our expectations, and it agrees with how we think the world should work, news organizations will run that. Stories are favored if they confirm our stereotypes, right? So if we think that something's going to happen, and that's confirmed, then we tend to value that. And I'll give you an example. I was searching around for an example, but the one that I've used in the past still works, which is going back to the Trayvon Martin case, in which you had George Zimmerman had shot and killed Trayvon Martin. The case drags on, it takes a while, and then we get to a point where we hear that there's going to be a verdict read, that the trial is wrapped up. And so what CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all the news channels, even the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, they were all camped out at that courthouse waiting for the verdict to be read. And I remember watching television with my friend as this was all going, and I was steadily jumping between Fox and CBS and CNN and NBC to see how the different channels, as a news person, I like to watch multiple broadcasts to see how they're covering it differently. What is their camera shot selection? What scenes are they using? What audio? How are they editing all this stuff? And so as I'm watching it, in particular, I think it was CNN, kept focusing on the fact that there were a group of African Americans that belonged to the Black Panther Party that were in attendance. And so they're talking about, you got to remember also in this Trayvon Martin era, when this verdict was released at that time period, you had also had riots all over the country in different places. So the predictability here is that when they read this verdict, if it's something the audience doesn't like, you're going to see a riot break out on live television. That was the expectation. So because of that news value of predictability, we think this is going to happen. We think CNN's betting, it's ratings gold if we can have a riot break out live on television and be in the middle of it. And they kept using the Black Panthers as a frame of reference, a visual frame of reference. So they would talk about what the verdict is going to mean to people, and how people are worried and concerned. And every now and then the camera would pan back over to the Black Panthers, who are all just kind of standing shoulder to shoulder, kind of in a line. watching everything happen. They keep talking, they show the Black Panthers again. Eventually, at some point in the night, the Black Panthers all have like a banner that they unfurl and some posters that talk about justice for Trayvon, right? So they stand there, and so CNN just keeps going back to them visually time and time and time again. You know, people are getting anxious, people are getting upset. Let's check back in with the, you know, at the scene, and then, well, the Black Panthers now have done blah, 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 blah. When they read the verdict, it is not the verdict that the people gathered there were hoping for. Zimmerman was exonerated, basically. He was not found guilty and held in prison. So you would think that people would get upset. CNN had been telling us all night people were going to get upset. People were going to get upset. And so the camera pans back over to the Black Panthers, and sure enough, all they do is fold up their banner and posters, and they walk away. And the crowd walks away. And so CNN was betting on this predictability value here. They wanted to be there to see if this riot's going to break out. Well, it didn't. Right? And it kind of just looked silly at the end. The flip side of predictability is unexpectedness. If something occurs that is so dramatically against our expectations, right? It stands so in staunch contrast to what we thought. That will grab our attention. And news organizations want to show you that as well. Probably the best example of this that I can think of is anytime a mother willingly, intentionally kills their children. We are culturally conditioned and surely believe that moms take care of their kids at all cost. Right? That mom is always a solid bedrock. And then something happens in society and a mother kills her children. And society wonders why. And they want to know that story. They want to follow that story because they want to know what happened that it could make someone do something that was so unpredictable, that's so against the grain of motherhood. And so that unexpectedness matters a good deal. Continuity. Once we get, and we could go back to the Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin trial here, once a story enters the agenda and it's taking a while to proceed, it kind of becomes a news value, a standard that the organization is going to update you on what's going on. So if you think about Supreme Court Brett Kavanaugh and the hearings around Kavanaugh, that's an issue of continuity. When you're having the hearings and then you have someone come out and accuse him, and then 2 or 3 people come out and accuse him. And then we have, we bring Kavanaugh and Ford before Congress to testify. And then we have a week-long FBI investigation. The story draws out more and more and more, and the news wants to constantly give you updates on that. That's an issue of continuity. The final news value that I'll just mention here is composition. And that just means news providers will seek to relate news that either fits in line with their ideology or it seeks balance among all the stories. So composition is a news value that has more to do with tone, right? So if your network traditionally runs more liberal pieces and your audience is typically leaning more towards liberal ideology, then the news stories that you pick are probably going to fit within that ideology. They're probably going to be pro-democrat, pro-liberal, pro-progressive, right? So it'll fit in line. The kind of other thing that's going on there with composition is if you feel like you do need a balance on things, you seek that balance out. And I'll show you an example in class. of what I think are really good composition pieces. Sometimes you'll have these composition pieces that are termed human interest stories. And so the history behind that is that as news kept going and you got bigger broadcasts, more people could see the broadcasts. Nightly news became more of a nationwide thing. People started complaining that, well, the news is just negative all the time. It just seems so negative. It's all about crime and horrible statistics and people uneasy about the future and telling you when things structurally in our system break. And so it didn't take long before news editors started to worry, are we being so negative that we are driving people away? And I've seen it myself on Facebook now. People are like, I just can't look at Facebook because the news just upsets me, right? So what news organizations have done is they've decided one tactic is to end the news with a human interest story, something that's light, uplifting, gives you hope, right? And you put that at the end of the news so that that's the image that an audience member leaves that news broadcast with, a sense of hope or happiness, right? So sometimes composition is fitting right in line with what you always do, or it could be, hey, you know what? We've skewed so far to this one feeling tonight, we need to break and contrast that. So that's composition. Now, along with news value, sometimes you have news constraints, things that keep you from publishing a story or breaking a news story, right? So, yes, there are things that may be important enough to cover, but sometimes there's still constraints that keep them from being covered. One's deadlines. So, you know, if we're talking about a daily newspaper that is published and on your doorstep bright and early, 6 a.m., 7 a.m., and then you still have some event that's going on, maybe a very important event, maybe an election or a sports game or something like that. But that event is going to go past when your deadline to publish is, right? So let's say that you have to have all your stories in by midnight in order to publish. But the football game goes long, goes past midnight, or an election is too close to call, and it takes some time before they have a result. And so because of that, you may say, well, we're not going to cover that in this edition. We'll have to pick it up tomorrow's edition, right? So that could kill a story. Resource limitations. You just don't have the money to cover a story. Hey, there's a soldier from Mississippi that's going to get a huge military award. Up in Michigan, they're going to give it to him. But we don't have enough money to get an airplane ticket, go up there, shoot everything ourselves, stay overnight, fly back down. It costs too much. It would cost too much to send somebody to cover that. So you don't cover it. Or maybe you look for footage that someone else shot and you play that, but you can't commit your resources there. It could be something as simple as, well, the station only has 4 cameras, so if 5 big things happen at the same time, at any time, we're going to have to decide what gets covered and what doesn't. So you may not have the resources you need. Geographical focus. Well, again, like I said, things that are happening every day in Jackson are not going to be important to people who live in Starkville, unless it affects them in terms of, when I say Jackson, like the state government. If teachers are not going to get a raise, or are going to get a raise, or are going to be laid off, or taxes are going to go down or go up or something like that, then yes, Jackson news will be covered in the Golden Triangle. But otherwise, if we're just talking about an auto accident, a fire, a spirited alderman or a city leader meeting, something like that. That's not going to get covered in Starkville if it took place in Jackson because the geographical focus just doesn't match up. So, I've kind of explained some of these, I guess. I thought that sorry, I blew that. So just look at these slides. This is just exactly what I just said, right? So the issue of news constraints being with deadlines, resource limitations, and also geographical focus, right? Okay. So we will, when we get in class, I do want to show you some stories. So it actually won't be one of these deals where it has been recently where we have a quiz and then we take off. I will have videos that I want you to see in class, so just keep that in mind. But we'll see each other next class, and we'll look at some examples of these things. So thank you for your time. See you next class.